Hello, everyone. I hope you're back again from the break. For these, well, first of all, I want to introduce myself. My name is Irene Alonso, and I'm the project manager of the Democratic Odyssey, currently working in the implementation of its second session, which, as many of you know, will take place in Florence in February. We are back again in the second session, and I wanted to tell you a bit more of who is here in the room with us. As you know, during the first session, we've had the members of the Athens Assembly, although I believe that some other people from the wider public have joined us already for that first session. In the second session, we've decided to open this online gathering also for the wider public, and that is our dearest constituent network, the friends of the Democratic Odyssey that are here to observe what happens during our online gathering, but also a pool that it's coming from Europe calling webinars of people that is particularly interested in participation and would like to be engaged in this process. We want to welcome you all for this session. And first of all, I would like to go through the outline of what this second hour will look like. So Max, if you go to the next slide, thank you so much. So in this second hour that, as you've observed, we are already running a bit late. First, we wanted to go through what kind of messages came up from Athens and therefore having the agreement with all of you on what kind of outputs we believe that are the ones that are consistent throughout the project. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time with the technical issues between the breakout rooms and the Mentimeter to actually finalize those messages. So first, we wanted to give you the full recap of how the Mentimeter has decided to group those messages and in what kind of categories those messages are for the different baskets we have. And then we will go on to actually introduce our analyst, Richard Young, which will give us a reflection on the different types of crisis, to afterwards finalize this session with the road to Florence and how we are going to somehow understand that road together. So let me go first through those messages that came from the Mentimeter. I was already mentioning before that for the first basket, we've had 5 different types of groups, and I'm going to repeat myself. What do you think are the main messages for our basket? What needs to be kept? Those 5 groups were participation and involvement, empathy, civil society participation, freedom of speech, and community solidarity. For our second basket, the messages that came up written by all of you on the Mentimeter after your group reflections were: what do you think are the main messages for our basket? What needs to change? Government accountability, political reform, citizen participation. Indeed, I think it needs to be changed and actually be deepened up. International cooperation and credible information. Those are the 5 groups of messages that need to change for that second basket. And the third one, what do you think are the main messages for our basket? What could have been done differently? Those 5 group of messages that we have are citizen consultation, crisis planning, citizen education, government accountability, and disinformation prevention. I believe these are the main categories of messages we will be working on the run-up to Florence. But first of all, to deepen our understanding on how all these messages came about, we wanted to invite an analyst that that has that can help us understand what kind of crisis we are struggling with, and how to somehow solve them on the basis of democratic renewal. Let me introduce to all of you Richard Young, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe and professor of international relations at University of Warwick, UK. He's a co-founder of the European Democracy Hub in Brussels, and he's also the author of 17 books. The most recent one, it's titled Democratic Crossroads: Transformation in 21st Century Politics, edited by Oxford University Press. And it is because of this particular book that we've effectively have invited you here, Richard. At the core of your thesis, you state that global democracy faces three transformative crises: climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and geopolitical tensions, which is very much the type of narrative and messages our members have explored throughout Athens. I give the floor to you to tell us a bit more about this.
Thank you, Irene, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all and to be following with great admiration all your work in the Odyssey. So I've been invited to intervene because I've just put a book out, which is on exactly the topic that you have all been discussing, the relationship between democracy and crisis. And in fact, my book basically reinforces, repeats exactly the points that have come out of your excellent report from Athens and the points that we just saw on the slides at the beginning of this session. Crisis is reshaping politics across the world. Every era has a crisis or one or more crises, but what's very distinctive about the last 10 or 15 years is just how many crises of different types there have been, how frequent crises have become. In a way, crisis management has become the new normal of politics, and this has a very profound implication for all of us because it means that democracy, faced with all these different crises, health emergencies, climate, economic, identity-related crises, has to reinvent itself. Democracy has to reinvent itself to show that it is the political system that is best equipped to deal with all these crises. And it has not yet done that. So we are faced with this very, very profound challenge. This means something very important for all of the work, for all of you and the work in which you are engaged. It means participative exercises like the Odyssey are now mainstream. They are now mainstream and they touch upon very existential issues of our political debates. They can no longer be seen as simply something secondary and nice to have. They sit at the very heart of our political debate, and they will define whether democracy prospers in the future or not. Quite simply, because of all the crises different regions around the world have faced in the last decade, the stakes for democracy have never been higher. And because of that, the challenge is complicated. And I just very, very briefly put on the table four issues that I thought might enrich your reflections in the Odyssey. First of all, the crises that we've seen in the last decade have unleashed a lot of very innovative, interesting, dynamic new citizen initiatives like the one you are all involved in, but it has also had exactly the opposite effect. It's added fuel to very authoritarian dynamics around the world. Many authoritarian systems have become more authoritarian as they've taken advantage of crises. Many democracies have become less democratic. There's been a centralization of power by governments in all kinds of political regimes across the world. Soberingly, many citizens around the world seem to have increased support for relatively non-democratic forms of government. Authoritarian governments, some at least, have been quite good at selling themselves as being regimes well equipped to deal with crises. So we do need to all be aware of this sobering reality. There have been lots of very heartening democratic initiatives like the Odyssey, but crises are also prompting exactly the opposite kind of tendency, adding fuel to authoritarian dynamics. That means all of you have a very strong incentive here because we are all engaged in a very fierce battle between different kinds of political regimes in terms of dealing with the crises that are likely to become the new normal in politics around the world. That's my first reflection. Second reflection, a bit more operationally, there's a huge number of initiatives have emerged in recent years, getting citizens like yourselves involved in politics. A lot of this is still quite low profile, it's quite scattered, and it's not joined together in a way that could maximize its effectiveness. Most initiatives around the world that have emerged are not really aimed at democracy per se. They're not aimed at redefining democracy in the abstract. They reflect citizens' concerns with much more specific issues, defending their communities from the effects of climate change, more effectively managing health emergencies, getting access to medical equipment. These kinds of very concrete initiatives are what have got people like yourselves engaged and involved in politics. I would call this a kind of democracy by action rather than a democracy by design. This is good, this is healthy, this is necessary, but it does mean, I think, for all of us, we still need to take the next step in thinking about how we move from these very specific concerns to the way we want our political systems to look over the medium to longer term. So that's my second point. Third point, these initiatives are not just about citizen assemblies like the Odyssey, like the initiative you have been involved in, but they take many, many different kinds of forms. What we've seen over the last decade is an unprecedented density and richness of initiatives getting citizens involved in politics. A huge increase in the number of citizen assemblies, but also of local community organizations, different kinds of local parties, social movements, protest organizations, bartering movements, dozens and dozens of different kinds of ways of getting citizens involved in politics. I think this is a challenge and something very interesting for your work in the Odyssey, because to me it means one of the key challenges is to get assemblies like yours harnessing and engaged with other forms of participation. I think this is one of the really important points that is in fact highlighted in your report from Athens. It defines the challenge very, very well, but to what comes out of my research is an observation that we still need to make a lot of progress in this area, because at present, all these different forms of democratic participation, all of them important, are still rather disconnected from each other. So that's my third reflection. And at any fourth point, and I'll finish here. This is the era of stronger societies, and your work reflects this, but it is also the era of stronger states. And to me, this means that the overarching challenge is that participation, citizens participating in politics, still need to engage with state authorities. State authorities have become stronger in their aims to manage crises, and participation needs to dovetail with these much stronger state capacities rather than being seen as separate from them. This is mentioned in your report. We just saw there was a whole category in the slides that was summarized at the beginning of the session. I would put it in this way, that I think to manage crises in a democratic way in the future, we need to combine the best of the top-down state powers on the one hand and bottom-up citizen engagement like yours on the other hand. That may seem quite abstract, but it seems to me it's that very practical joining together of societies and states that will define how well democracies can manage crises compared with other kinds of political systems. And with that, I finish. This would be my conclusion then, Irene. I think it's a difficult challenge. It's a difficult challenge because it means that crisis management needs to be quicker. As citizens, we all want our governments to respond quickly and effectively, but also in a way that's open and transparent. Participation needs to be very local. It needs to be rooted in communities. But as citizens, we also expect big crisis initiatives to be forthcoming at the European level or at the global level. And to me, this speaks of the basic challenge, I think, that will set politics for the next 2 decades, is that states and societies need to work together. We need to find ways of docking initiatives like the Odyssey into state authorities rather than states and societies being seen to be in rivalry with each other.
Thank you so, so much, Richard. You went just right into the point. 2 weeks ago, we were having a conversation about how the Democratic Odyssey could actually be shaped in a way in which you have an institutional design so citizens can effectively be embedded in the institutions to quickly react to crisis. So perhaps on those lines is where the Democratic Odyssey should go. I wanted to open this space for all participants to actually have some reactions and ask questions to Richard. So feel free to take the floor and reflect a bit on what it has inspired you.
Do you want us just to jump in? Because I see that Theo has his hand up.
Right. Theo, if you would like to jump in.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. It was a very informative presentation, this one. I totally agree with authoritarian reactions that Dr. Richard said. We could see that in the case of COVID-19, that the measures that were taken initiated from the top. No one had asked the people if they want to be vaccinated or not, whether they should stay at home or they should be free to walk around. I have a point, though, in the stronger states observation that you made. We live in an era of globalization, and I think that the role of the state is becoming more and more less and less important as far as the economic decisions are concerned. So how do you say that the states are becoming stronger nowadays? I don't very much agree on that.
Irene, would you like me to
Thank
come
you,
back, or you
Theo.
collect?
I'm wondering if we could perhaps collect a couple of questions. Or otherwise, while participants think of possible questions, you can directly react to Theo. I see Stefan has a hand.
Yes, thank you. It's a very quick one. Richard, how do we convey this message to those in power successfully?
Thank you, Stefan. And Savina?
Yes, thank you. To elaborate a bit more about what Theo said, it is true. I recognize that the global crisis had probably required from the state to be more strong, more capable in their reaction. But at the same time, what we are seeing happening at least in the Western countries is the declining of the trust of citizens in government. And this is continuing after the pandemic too. So how do you explain this? How do you connect with this idea of the more strongest governments than before?
Thank you so much, Sabina. We are gonna jump right into answering those questions, and then we go back for a second round. That sounds okay?
On Theo's point about the states, I would say this is probably true up until about 2010, but then as a result of the economic crisis and the pandemic, and also over a longer period of time, the gradual rise of the importance of the climate emergency, we have seen governments take on more powers, begin to expand their expenditure. And if you look at the figures, the size of states in most countries has begun to increase over the last 5 or 6 years. The point I wanted to make was that these gradual increase in the size of power capacities of states can be good news and bad news for democracy. If states take on more power in ways that it's not very transparent, not very accountable, not very responsive, it can add to this wave of authoritarianism that many analysts talk about as being the defining feature of the era. But on the other hand, additional state powers can be very helpful democracy. It's in a way, it's what democracies need to correct some of the social and economic inequalities and imbalances that have done so much to weaken democracy over the last decade. So it's a very fine balance to draw. And again, I think it reinforces the importance of the work that all of you are doing, because this is an era in which governments are trying tentatively to move into, this is a bit jargon heavy, but to what people refer to as a kind of post-neoliberal age, an age where we don't assume the market can do everything, but where states need to rebuild their capacity to deal with crises, to address citizens' concerns. That's beginning to happen, but for that to happen in a way that is beneficial to democracy, it relies on people like yourselves engaging in this kind of initiative to hold these enhanced state powers and capacities to account. We need enhanced state powers, bigger states, more effective states, but we also need those states to be accountable and not only effective. That was the point I was trying to make, Theo. And I think that relates to Stefan's point. I think that the message needs to come from initiatives like this, and it's probably a more effective way to do politics than analysts and writers just trying to make the point over and over again. So I think it's very important that within the Odyssey you've developed this, as Nicola was saying in the beginning, this focus on media outreach, because I think that's the kind of thing that will help your very important messages and these excellent points in the report from Athens resonate with those in power. And on Sabina's point on trust, the figures on trust in government are quite complicated. Actually, they differ between different governments and over time. So you need to be a bit careful what we read from the polls. But I think those countries that did manage most effectively to deal with the pandemic in particular, or have put in place fairly effective climate resilient measures, are those that have maintained higher levels of trust. But again, my point would be that you can't just create that trust by dealing with crises in a very technocratic or top-down way. What the evidence shows very, very clearly is that trust is more likely to come about when citizens feel that they have a stake in the decisions that are being made on their behalf.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the answering of those questions. I'm gonna give the floor to Sarah for the next round.
Thank you, Irena. Yeah, I was wondering actually how democracy can stand true during an actual crisis. I know it's a major topic, but in terms of like, what advice do you have, Richard, or insights do you have on how we could actually use democracy in a state of emergency? Because I've lived in Egypt before for a few years, and they're constantly in a state of emergency, and that gives the the government the right, or is this the wrong word to use, to do whatever they want. And then we see that in the crises we had in Europe. So how can democracy stand up in a state of emergency, actually? Do you have any tips for that? Insights? Thank you.
Sorry, let's get a couple of more questions in here. So I see, Gerd, you also have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to, in a sense, reinforce the point that Richard made about the need to combine a variety of initiatives, some of which target democracy and the ways in which democracy is actually done, with other initiatives that don't see themselves as being political in any way, that look at more practical things. And I think that's important because so many people these days have a high level of distrust in politicians, and therefore also in democracy. When you come to them and you say, look, we need to improve democracy, they will likely say, this is politics, I'm not interested in politics, politics is all corrupt. But at the same time, there are plenty of people out there who want to engage, who want to participate, who want to contribute to the world they live in. And they want to do this around what they consider to be non-political, very practical issues. Now, of course, these two things are, of course, connected, but I think you have to make this connection explicit. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when developing democratic assemblies such as this one. It's also important when you think about other citizen assemblies, be they about climate or health or whatever other issues, that this is actually, these are two sides of the same coin that need to be combined, but it won't happen automatically. So thank you, Richard, for making that point and highlighting that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gerd. I'm going to give the floor to Tony.
Thank you, Irina. I just wanted to refer to what Richard was saying about the danger of populism. And I think citizens' assembly, generally the participatory democracy, is an ally of politicians if it is done properly. If you think about difficult decisions, this is what the majority of the politicians try to stay away. And we saw it in Ireland in 2012, when very difficult decisions were relegated to a citizens' assembly. So the politicians might say, or they did say, well, this is not our verdict on what needs to be done. It's you, the representatives of the nation, that has jointly come to that resolution. That was accepted by the parliament, and Ireland had a law. And this principle, if it is properly firmed up in an institutional arrangement like that we are discussing now, the European Citizens Assembly, that can work very well, because the populists have actually gone into the space, empty space, the void that has been created by politicians not making transparent decision. And there was so much discussion in Athens about transparency. And this is where we can, so to speak, help the politicians in their difficult task, and also become more engaged directly as citizens in decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that comment, Tony. We are having a bit of a pile of hands in here, it seems. So I'm going to give the floor to the next person, Daina, and then we can do another round of questions, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. My question would be, could Mr. Richard please describe his kind of predictions? What would be artificial intelligence influence on democracy and the widening digital gap between citizens and governments and so on? So in that point, thank you.
Thank you for the very relevant question, Naina, when it comes to artificial intelligence. Richard, would you like to take this round of questions?
Yeah, Sarah's question about democracy in state of emergencies. It's a good question. I think there's some quite different kinds of crisis. I think we all accept that in the pandemic, even well-meaning governments had to abridge, had to limit some democratic rights in the worst moment of the pandemic. The issue is that they then tended to hang on to those powers in a rather dishonest way. And in fact, if you look at the different regions across the world, there's only one region where the level of democratic rights has been restored to its pre-pandemic level still now. So it shows that governments were a bit disingenuous in hanging on to those emergency powers. I'd say the climate crisis is probably one where governments perhaps recognize more the need for citizen input. It's a kind of quasi-permanent crisis, so it's going to last for a long time. It's a different kind of crisis to the pandemic that erupted from nothing, then disappeared after a couple of years, or abated after a couple of years. I think the climate crisis generally recognized that it's impossible to tackle climate change without getting communities involved. Communities have to be part of the solution. I think maybe in principle governments recognize that, but then they still fall into the temptation of declaring emergency laws, and even in democratic states that then just give themselves more powers. So I think the climate issue there, Sarah, will be the one that really gives us provides the kind of test case. I think Gert puts the point very, very well about the political nature of a lot of initiatives. For me, it's a question of people engaging with issues related to crisis, if that's our subject matter here, in ways that are perhaps not political in a partisan way, but they are still political. They're perhaps political with a small p rather than a capital P, or a party sense of political. And I think, again, it's getting that balance right. It doesn't mean that these kinds of initiatives should be apolitical, but just perhaps political in a different way. That I think relates to Tony's point about assemblies like this. They need to be directly beneficial to mainstream politics, but not in a way that mainstream politicians can use them for their own ends in a very instrumental way. And sometimes that is what's happened to such initiatives, and there need to be safeguards ring-fenced against that. AI is a huge topic, and as we've only got about 3 or 4 minutes left, that's probably a bit beyond me. But you all know at the moment, the prevailing opinion is quite negative on AI, that it's going to be more damaging than beneficial to democracy. If it develops to a certain degree, it undermines the whole, this perhaps gets a bit philosophical, but it undermines the whole basis of individual agency. Without individual agency, you cannot have a healthy democracy. So it is a real risk. But there are many people exploring the more positive sides of AI. Many of them are on the screen. They're much more expert than I am. People looking at AI as ways of fostering deliberation, and then organizations here that have been at the cutting edge of that. So I wouldn't say it's completely negative, but if you get the regulation of AI and the business models of the tech companies sorted out, then that might leave us more scope for exploring the positive side of AI.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, we've just seen that perhaps it can work for at least grouping the kind of messages from a deliberation, although to be questioned whether it's reality that those messages reflect what has come up from the participants. I want to give the floor to Margit.
Thank you, Irene. Yeah, I was wondering, Richard mentioned that state and societies have to work together better. And I was wondering, are there any concrete examples where this is already happening? I believe Tony mentioned something in Ireland where this in 2012 happened, worked really well. And I know in Switzerland, for example, they often do referendums. But are there any other forms of where this is already happening? I'm asking because when I hear examples, it always helps me better to understand this and maybe come up with ideas how to also find new ways how to do this. Thanks.
Thank you for that question. I'm also going to give the floor to Mauro.
Yes, thank you. I would also like to stress the point made by Richard and maybe moving it a little bit away from a sort of, let me say, defensive crisis management towards a more proactive management of priorities. Or if you want to put it in another way, maybe we are within a permanent crisis. So we need to act and we need to strengthen the states, which have to be accountable. And we need, at the same time, as Richard said, to strengthen the participation of ourselves as citizens. And we need both to build trust and to revive democracies. I think we are really within a crisis of the model of representative democracies. No, representative democracy means not direct democracies, but democracy where the people is represented in parliaments and the credibility of parliament is suffering. And the credibility of the European Parliament is maybe suffering more because it's a second layer. So we really need to put those pieces better together. So thank you, Richard, for your input.
Thank you for that, Mauro. Stratis, would you like to ask your question? You are muted.
Now I'm okay.
Yes.
Hello, everybody.
We can hear you.
I'd like to raise an issue about quality of political leaders, not only in Europe, but we are talking mostly about Europe. When there is a lack of trust in the heads of its countries, say, with very, very few exceptions. I'm talking about the majority of the countries that have a very poor leadership, thus creating lack of interest of citizens in participating in decision making. We see that with the huge amounts of people not going to vote all over Europe. We saw that in the European elections, but we also see it in local elections, okay, national elections. So I think this is a very big problem that citizens keep on losing their faith and their belief in their leaders. I'd like to have Richard's opinion about that. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Stratis. I do see a name here, but I don't think that's your right name. Chairperson.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. That is Donald. Sorry.
Good to see you.
It's the name. Good to see you too. And I want to thank Mr. Richard and what Mr. Levendidis has just said now. It's highly a big challenge. I do know that as someone who has been following the politics of Greece, Europe in general, and then Africa as well, where I'm originated from, that has been a huge challenge that people don't go to vote because they have the ability to overturn the masses voting and all the rest. So that has been a huge challenge. And I also want to say that I don't know if we can get from our professor today a way, because I do know in Greece, if the government do not recognize your institution, like the way they do, they do have some recognition, not 100%, but partial recognition for the ombudsman as well, that mediates legally between the citizens and the leaders of the state, or even to citizen. They don't stand for you in court, but at least they can mediate for you to get somehow some kind of information for you to be able to go to court. Now, how do we now legalize within each of our country through the parliament for them to recognize these democracy, this democratic body that we're talking about here today, that we are present in a way that when crisis comes up, they are obliged to involve us in deliberations and solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Donald. I'm gonna give the final word to Joy when it comes to questions.
Hi, everyone. It's there's so many interesting points already being made, but I'd like to take it a bit further, a bit to a more early stage of civil participation. And I think that in times of crisis, and especially in times of permanent crisis, we see people losing their trust in the system and then looking for saviors, which is it's a very good ground for populism to rise. And this is why we see a lot of populism, especially in countries where the citizens are more stressed or they feel like their quality of life is decreasing significantly. And at the same time, when their quality of life is decreasing, these people need to spend more time focusing on survival or making their life better, and they don't have enough time to participate in politics or to tell their opinion about political affairs because they don't have enough time or energy to devote to it. So I would like to ask Richard, how do we begin people's participation in politics, especially in times with a permanent crisis and when people cannot focus that much on it or don't want to focus that much on it?
Thank you for that, Joey.
I'll come in. I realize we're already over time, so I'll be very, very quick and a bit selective. I think, Joy, your question was quite similar to Strategy's question about this paradox that people look for saviors, they look for strong leaders to get them out of crises. I suppose the good news for us is that people can be easily drawn to populist leaders, but they get very fed up with them very quickly as well. I mean, the populist leaders can rise very quickly, but their popularity tends to be quite brittle and it can disappear quite quickly as well. I think that's the message to sell to people that maybe are focused on very day-to-day matters and don't feel they have the incentive to get involved in decision making, that by having a kind of longer term stake in decision making, they don't need to rely on these kind of figures, can disappoint very, very quickly. That's the kind of message that I would be selling. Margit's question is a good one. Where are the really successful models of governments and democratic initiatives working best together? I would say a place like Taiwan is probably the best example that's normally cited at so many different levels. It did happen in some places during the pandemic, like Korea, New Zealand, Canada, some other places, where you got different levels and authorities and citizens working together. Unfortunately, that didn't really follow through fully into the post-pandemic period, but there was some signs there that it could be done. And then Mauro's point is a good one because it basically reflects what I argue in the book, and that is that so far there has been an awakening of citizen engagement in politics because of crises. But exactly as you say, it is quite defensive and ad hoc still. And maybe it's understandable that that's the case because we're all so concerned just with our day-to-day survival in crisis situations. It seems to me initiatives like yours, like the Odyssey, can help us think through what the next stage is. So we have a more, exactly as you say, Mauro, a more proactive agenda to think how we redefine democracy over the longer term. It's not easy, particularly, Donald, to wrap up with your point, because the legal side doesn't look very good. Organizations, many of them online here, have been pressing for formalization of these kind of commitments for a long time. But in fact, if anything, the legal sphere is going the other way. What we've seen during the course of 2024 are dozens and dozens of new laws that actually target democratic activists, target civil society, put democratic activists in jail. And the international community still needs to mobilize around this problem to make sure we actually defend the kind of political space that you are all operating in, because otherwise these kind of innovations that we all know are so important just won't have the space to breathe and survive in the longer term. I've been very quick there, Irene, but I think I'll close it with that.
I think we can indeed go on deliberating. You should accompany us in Florence to actually make the bridge from your book to the kind of conversations we've been having all together within the Democratic Odyssey. Thank you so much for that, Richard. We will be following up with the participants on the webinar and the different topics that have come up from this conversation, in case you would be actually interested in continuing this kind of discussion. In fact, we wanted to close this session by launching your most favorite tool, I hope, after this webinar, which is another Mentimeter, in which we wanted to ask you what kind of topics after this online gathering together you'd think should be discussed on the run-up to Florence. So it's for us a way to concretize what has come out of Athens, also what kind of topics are somehow vibrating with us and are sparking our attention, and how those messages could be brought up to the second session of the Democratic Odyssey on site, which will be happening in Florence as of February. I invite you to do the same process as before. Write menti.com in your browser or scan the QR code. The code is 64907256. And the idea for you is to type after this conversation what kind of messages we need to definitely work with on the run-up to Florence.
Just to say that again, if there's anyone who's struggling with opening Menti or anything, you can write it into the chat and we'll paste it into the Menti.
It's open, but it's not possible to put anything there. It looks like closed.
It's not possible to write in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's only possible to say yes or no, responses with votes, responses without votes, thumbs up, but no message possible, indeed, yeah.
So welcome to Things Alive. Can you do it now?
Now.
No.
No.
Now it seems to work.
Yes, it works now.
Yes,
It's
now it's
working
possible.
now. Yeah.
Now it's
Works
possible. Now it's working.
It's working.
Okay, so the Mentimeter is effectively working, and now we're seeing the first replies to that question. What messages do you think should be discussed in Florence? From the conversation we were just having with Richard, definitely I would assume that the issue of trust is something that we definitely need to tackle in what comes next for us in the Democratic Odyssey. But in any case, some other replies to that are collaboration with governments. How should Europe become more people-oriented? We say political reform, but what do we mean exactly? Citizens' participation in policy making, civic education, relationship between this assembly and other democratic groups. Indeed, how to strengthen citizens' participation operationally in a dialogue with the institutions, the role of civil society, or how can citizen actions be linked to wider democratic deliberation? Some other replies to that are, how can we defend democratic space, addressing the laws that target civil society activism, or build trust through a connection between citizens and institutions? I don't want to take more of your time, but definitely what we see with this kind of answers are two things. If Athens served for us to actually understand the topic of crisis and what kind of crises have affected us and how those crisis could be put together in a category of things that happened to us collectively. Perhaps Florence is for us to actually define those crises and concretize it so it can have a specific recommendation with regards to how citizens and institutions work together. Thank you so much for giving us those answers. We are gonna take good care of those responses and put them together in the online platform to continue the conversation. And we also wanted to ask you two more things before closing this session. As you know, this online gathering is the first, but what we aim for is to actually have webinars with you. We would be interested in providing you with two particular things before our next on-site session. The first one is that we would like to have webinars with different types of experts that could provide a specific type of information that you would be interested in. And the second thing we would like is also to ask you what kind of skills you would think might be necessary for a better deliberation. We were perhaps thinking that it would be interesting to give you some workshops on how to do direct communication or active listening. And for that, we've put these other two questions together for you to tell us what would be of your interest to participate on those webinars. Thank you for those answers. So I see that several of you have answered in terms of listening skills, conflict resolution, mediation, teamwork, active participation and listening. We will pass this question also through the online platform that, as you know, is your space to comment and to even initiate debates if you would like to. And we will keep informing you and communicating with you on what comes next for those webinars to happen, to be all together and to learn a bit more from each other. I want to close the session now. And thank you all for. Yes, I think that, Max, I think that question was already answered in the previous slide. I want to thank you all for participating. I hope it made sense. As you know, you've received the report, the deliberation report, kindly done by the team, of what kind of messages were put forward in Athens. You can go through it and reflect on the open debate that it's posted in the online platform. We will be in contact with you also, particularly for the selection of new ambassadors for the Florence Assembly. And we remain at your disposal in case you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining us today.